Alright everybody, welcome to this walkthrough of shooting with the Kodak Stereo Camera. Now, when I was first starting to shoot with this camera, I would have loved to have had a walkthrough like this one because I couldn't find one. And I did fortunately find a manual, and the manual was pretty well designed, but it would have been a bit easier if I'd found somebody who could maybe help me through this process a little. So what I'm going to do is go through this and give the kind of tips that I wish I had gotten and the kind of information I wish I had easily had access to when I first picked up this camera. I'm going to do this from the perspective of somebody who has shot digitally before, who is familiar with the basics of photography, but who doesn't have a lot of experience shooting on film and who doesn't have any experience shooting with stereo cameras specifically. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the parts of this camera and what they're for, and then how the functions work, and some things that you have to think about with this camera that you maybe wouldn't have to think about with other types of cameras. Alright, here we go. So as you can see, first of all, it comes in this nice hard leather brown case. The previous owner, whoever it was, put a little note on the top about using the flash and filters and other things. There was no flash that came with this where I bought it at a thrift store, but it did have a couple of filters in it, and I've since gotten more filters that I'm excited to give a try. In fact, when I open this up, you'll see a couple of them. So we start by opening that up, and here is the camera right here. And you can see I've got these red filters on the front, and these are a fairly common type of filter that's used in black and white photography. But I'm going to go ahead and take those off. Alright, so this is what the camera is going to look like. And it is attached to this case with a screw. I'm going to take that off, and we're going to mount it on this tripod here. And this is just a standard screw, 1/4-20 screw. And that's going to fit real nicely on our tripod mount. This strap with the camera I actually pulled off of something else. It didn't come with the camera itself. And you can see that my camera has a little bit of damage right here. Unfortunately, that was my fault. I tripped as I was going out the door holding the camera, and fell on the ground. It was in the case, but it still did enough damage to crack the housing. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to have impacted the function of the camera, and that's great. Alright, so the first thing you're going to notice that's different about this camera is that it has two lenses. Of course, that is to create the stereoscopic effect. These days, a lot of people do stereo photography by taking two pictures, each a few inches apart from each other, with a single lens camera. Stereo cameras are designed to make it so that you don't have to do that, so that you can take a single shot, capture a single moment in time with two lenses, and this, with matching shutter speeds and apertures and stuff like that, so that you can take both of those shots at the same moment, and then you pair up the shots afterwards. From this point on, it's important that we don't open that anymore until we're totally finished shooting the roll and we have all the way rewound it. Alright, so let's wind this thing. Now, unlike a lot of film cameras, when you're shooting with the Kodak Stereo Camera, you have to think about getting film not just behind one lens, but also behind both lenses, and so we need to get unexposed film behind both of those lenses. Right now, all of that film that we stretched across the back has been exposed to light, and so there's nothing there that can capture an image for us. We need to get new film out of the canister behind each one of these lenses, and in order to do that, we're going to use this little wind knob. So let's tilt the camera forward a bit here so we can see it. And we're going to just wind it. There's a click. So we wound it and it clicked once. That's a good sign. Now what we need to do is cover up these lenses so that no light can come through. I'm going to use a piece of paper. I'm going to cover these lenses so that no light can come through. and I'm going to press the shutter release button. That releases the latch that's holding that film in that position without actually exposing the film. Now I'm going to wind it again. Second click. Cover it. Wind it again. Third click. Cover it. Wind it again. Fourth click. So that's the fourth time. We need to do this until we have 4 good clicks. Now we're not going to press the shutter button again this time, but we've got to get those 4 clicks mean that we have now got film that stretches all the way across both lenses. Now, of course, those lenses are only going to expose little areas, and there's going to be an unexposed area in between the 2 lenses. So when we take our next picture and advance the film, what's going to happen is it's only going to go part of that distance, and the next 2 frames are also going to be 4 spaces apart. For example, if you take a look at these negatives, you can see that that's what's going on here, that we have matching stereo pairs separated on the roll of film by a few frames. Now this camera is really cleverly designed so that every few shots it's going to wind a little bit differently, so that you're making sure you're using that entire strip of film and not just getting stuck in double exposing things after a few shots. But the point is you're always going to have some space in between, and that's why it's important for us to wind that 4 times. Not only do we get unexposed film behind both lenses, but we also get that spacing that allows us to use or make the most of that entire strip of unexposed film in the canister. Next on our list, if we tilt the top down here, you can see that we've got a couple of dials. This one is the rewind knob. You're going to use that to rewind your film once it is finished. Once you're finished shooting a roll. Of course, I have a roll in here right now, so I'm not going to do that. This is going to be your advance knob. You're going to turn this to advance the film after you take a picture. These other 2 are a little bit different, and I didn't know what they were for at first. It took me a little bit of research to find out. This first one over here is your indicator for how many shots you have in the camera. Now, I have just loaded this with a 36 exposure roll of film. And so what I need to do now is I need to set this dial to show how many exposures I have left. Okay? And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to turn it to this red diamond. So the arrow is pointing at that red diamond. If I were using a 24 exposure roll of film, I would set it to this red 20. Well, why 20? Why not 24? Isn't that the number of pictures on the roll? Well, not really. In this case, because we're shooting a stereo camera, we're actually taking 2 pictures at the same time. So then you might think, well, why not 12 then? If I'm only getting if I'm taking 2 shots at once, doesn't that give me half the number of exposures? And the answer again is not quite, because the aspect ratio from this stereo camera is longer or taller than it is wide. You're going to be getting an aspect ratio that once it's scanned and edited comes out to being roughly square, but on the strip of film it's actually pretty tall and narrow. And so what that means for your exposure count is that it's only going to use up maybe a little more than half of the typical 35mm frame. So what it boils down to when you have a 24 exposure roll of film is that you end up getting about 20 shots out of it. If you have a 36 exposure roll of film, you end up getting somewhere around 28 shots out of it. So by using this red diamond right here, every time I advance the film, it will count down one step. And then I'll have an idea of just how many shots are left on my roll by looking at here. Remember, this is a count down, not a count up. And again, for 24, you'd start at 20 and then you'd count down to 0. And I found it to actually be pretty accurate that way. This other one right here is a reminder for you of what type of film you have in the camera. It doesn't actually affect anything in the camera, it's just a reminder for you. Sometimes cameras will have a little note card area on the back or something, or a window that lets you look in and see the roll of film. This camera doesn't have either of those. This is what it has instead. Now, the stereo camera was originally designed to be shot with Kodak Kodachrome slide film, and they don't make that anymore. There are some other slide films you can get that have similar properties, but that's why it says Kodachrome Daylight or Type A on that dial. And so the idea would be that if you're using Daylight film, you set it to this arrow. If you're using Kodachrome Type A, you would set it to that arrow. For me, I'm using black and white film, and Kodak always anticipated that people would do that, so they have this black and white arrow that's meant to indicate I'm using black and white film, and then this empty arrow right here means that the film compartment is empty. So if you're going to put this away without any film in it, you set the arrow to there, and then the next time you look at it, it helps you remember, oh yeah, there's nothing in there right now. Is that the most effective way of showing you what's in your camera? No, of course not, but it's the way they've got. So I'm going to set this to black and white because that's what I've got in there at the moment. All right, cool. So that's an overview of that main top of the camera. Now let's take a look at this section right here, because this was one of the most intriguing sections of this camera to me. It should be obvious if you have any photography experience, especially using manual settings, that what we're looking at here is a shutter speed dial and an aperture dial on the bottom. The thing that's unusual about them is that they're flat. They're not wrapped around a lens or anything like that. And the reason for that is because you've got to control two lenses. The Kodak Stereo Camera's lenses are controlled in sync with each other. So when you turn one, the other one turns as well. Similarly, when you adjust the shutter speed, it adjusts that shutter speed for both cameras. And you can see we have as our options 1/200th of a second, 100, 50, 25th of a second, and then a bulb mode. That's a pretty limited shutter range, but it's what the camera was designed for. I was actually kind of surprised to find a bulb mode on this camera. For those who don't know, a bulb mode is a mode where as long as you're pressing down this shutter button, the shutter will stay open. And so you can use it to do long exposures, to get better pictures in low light. That's a handy thing to have. All right, so let's set this back to 50, right there. All right, and then our other control is right here. This is our aperture control. And as you can see, as we pull this across, that little black arrow moves and it's pointing to the aperture setting that we've chosen. And we have a range from f3.5 all the way up to f22. We're going to set it right at this red dot in between f5.6 and f8. Now you might also notice that there are some words in between: bright, hazy, cloudy, bright. Those are common lighting conditions for when you're shooting, and we're going to come back to those in just a minute. Then on our lenses, you can see that we've got some other types of things you might recognize. On this lens, we have a pretty familiar series of numbers that's going to represent the distance to your subject. The thing about shooting with a stereo camera is that it's not an SLR, which means that when you look through the viewfinder, what you're going to be seeing is the view that comes out of this center lens right here, right in between the other two. It's going to help you to know what you're shooting, but it's not going to show you whether that object is in focus, and it's not going to show you your depth of field or anything like that. Well, that's what these lens readouts are for. So if my subject is 4 feet away from me, I could turn my lens to right there and focus it at 4 feet. If my subject is further away, maybe 12 feet, I'd put it right here, kind of between 10 and 15. So I'd have to either measure or be pretty good at estimating in that case to be super precise with that focus. There's another way to use this though, and it's pretty interesting. So maybe this is familiar to other people, and maybe it's my lack of experience shooting on film. That means, or at least with older cameras, that makes me unfamiliar with it, but take a look at this other lens. Rather than having numbers, it has scenes, groups, and close-ups. And of course I can turn this lens to be in between those somewhere, but I can also just turn it to line up with one. So if I'm doing a close-up, I can put it right there. Well, you might be thinking, but that doesn't really help too much because it doesn't show exactly where the focal distance is or to my object that's in focus, right? Well, guess what? It's not actually just intended to show you your focal distance. It's intended to help you read your depth of field. And you do that by looking at that distance in conjunction with your aperture setting. So let's say, for example, that my aperture is set right here to f8. Okay. Now, if I look back over on this other lens, you'll see that in addition to the distance readings on the top, I've also got these red numbers on the bottom that are aperture readings. They're clearly aperture readings, only they don't move. So what good are they? Well, let me explain. You see that we've got f8, f5.6, and f3.5. Then we've got our little arrow indicator, and we've got f3.5, f6, and f8. Well, my aperture right now is set to f8. And if I set my focus to close-ups using the other lens, then what I can do is look at what the distances on this lens say in between the two f8 readings. So this f8 reading right here is probably about 3 feet. The 3 is not actually marked on here, but it's looking at the scale somewhere around 3 feet, maybe a little less. On the other side, this f8 lines up right between 8 and 10 feet, so around 9 feet. What that tells me is that my shot should be in acceptable focus if my subject is anywhere between about 3 feet and 9 feet from the camera. So at f8, I've got a pretty decent estimation of my depth of field. Of course, the closer to the center of that distance, the closer it's going to be to being perfectly in focus. But the focus should be acceptable anywhere in that range. So these two lens readings are designed to give you an idea of your depth of field when you're shooting different types of subjects. If I'm shooting close-ups and I'm using an aperture of, say, f3.5, let's go another way, all the way to that end, right? Then if I look at these readings, they come in right between 4 feet and 6 feet, those two 3.5s right there. And what that means is that between 4 feet and 6 feet at f3.5, that's my area of acceptable focus. That's my depth of field estimate, right? So it's a pretty handy thing. And this dot, this red dot that they like to highlight so much, is also represented on here. It's right in between the f8 and the f5.6, as you can see. There's that little dot right in between those readings. All right, so those are tools to help me gauge my depth of field and to help me set my focus for the distance. Remember, when you're shooting on film, and a lot of film cameras, you don't automatically get to see that. Some of them have a depth of field preview, but while you can often, even with an SLR, see that your shot is in focus, you can't always see the depth of field of that shot, depending on what camera you're using. And on this camera, you never can see it. You just have to use these tools that are built into the camera to try to calculate it. All right, so let's talk about what comes next in shooting this camera. So we know what the two dual lenses are for. We know how to focus our shot. We know how to choose our shutter speed, and we know how to choose our aperture setting. We're going to be using a light meter to calculate what the correct settings are based on our knowledge of our film's ISO rating and the lighting conditions that we have here. Right now in here I have a roll of film with an ISO rating of 400. So that's what I'm going to be using in my calculations. And I've got another video that'll be coming out soon about using a light meter to calculate your exposure. But once we get all of our settings dialed in, we're going to look through our viewfinder. And when I look through the viewfinder, I can see this little green bubble level right here. And I can see that it's not level, so I'm going to level that out a little bit better for my shot. And that's about the only information I can get when I look through my viewfinder. Okay, and so I'm going to take a light meter reading with the meter in my pocket. And it's telling me with an ISO of 400 without any exposure compensation, and an aperture of between 5.6, it's about 6.7 for my aperture rating. I need an exposure for what I'm looking at of about 1/8 of a second. Now that is definitely lower than what my camera is currently capable of doing. My subject is approximately 4 to 5 feet away from me, so I'm going to dial that in over here real quick. Just with my subject just being my tripod for the camera that I'm shooting this on. And okay, so I've got my subject chosen, I have focused it, I've chosen my settings, and I've got the camera leveled off for my shot. Now I'm going to just press this button to take my picture. There it goes. And you heard that click. Now, of course, the camera's in bulb mode right now, which is why that click was so slow, but that was the shutter releasing. Now it's time to wind my camera to the next frame, and there it is. That's how you shoot on this camera. Now, there's a couple more things to think about that you can do. When it's time to roll your film back up, when you're finished, what you're going to do is look at the bottom of the camera, and there's a latch that you'll need to hold down manually while you rewind the film, and then you can take this rewind knob, and you'll notice that the advancement knob also turns while you're rewinding it. Once the film comes off of that part of the camera, then that knob will stop turning, as you can see right here. And that means that you're almost done. So you'll wind it a few more times, and once it feels nice and loose, like you've got the whole thing wound, then you're finished winding. Then you simply pop open the back of the camera, and you can take your roll of film out. You'll need to lift up the rewind knob, and then your roll of film should come out easily. If it feels like you have to force it, don't do it. Just make sure you get that knob all the way up so that the film canister is fully released. When I first got this camera, there was a roll of film in it that someone had left, and it was in upside down. And what that meant is that it was kind of tricky to get out. Someone had really shoved it in there, had pulled the film across the wrong way, and it was the film was actually upside down in the loader. So I had to use like a screwdriver to pry it out, and that's definitely not good for the camera. That film should come out easily. So there's my walkthrough of the Kodak Stereo Camera. I really hope you found this useful. I know that a few months ago when I was first starting this project, it would have been really helpful to me to have somebody walk through all those different things for me, instead of having to look through endless documents and hunt online for manuals to try to figure things out myself. Those are good resources, but sometimes it's easier to just have somebody show you. So I hope you found this useful, and thanks again for watching.